Originally, it was supposed to be a NATO foreign ministers meeting to plan a birthday party. But at 75, the same alliance that just a few years ago wondered whether it had outlived its purpose now has to instead how to quickly figure out how to take on more responsibility. Up to now, the United States ran traffic for when it came to arming Ukraine. But the eventuality of a return of Donald Trump has members, including the current administration in Washington, preferring that NATO headquarters safeguard that remit. We'll ask about plans to Trump-proof the military alliance in the face of Russia, a Russia that's expected to go on the offensive in Ukraine. On that score, we'll ask about Kyiv's battle plan, its lowering of conscription age from 27 to 25, and what a long war means for the whole of Europe. Today in the France 24 debate, NATO's plan to Trump-proof itself. Joining us, former German ambassador to NATO, Joachim Biederlich, professor of international relations at the ESCP Business School. Thanks for being with us. From Brussels, former NATO policy chief Fabrice Potier, CEO of political consultancy Rasmussen Global. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Welcome.
And from Kyiv, Gulliver Cragg, our correspondent. Good to see you, Gulliver.
Good evening.
Your reactions on the hashtag F24 debate. Yeah, it's proving a hard sell among a few outliers. Hungary, for one, leading the resistance to NATO's plan to take over what are piecemeal weapons contributions currently from the US-led ad hoc coalition known as the Rammstein Group and turn them into a 100 billion euro, 5-year fund for Ukraine. Still, diplomats believe they can reach consensus in time for the 75th anniversary summit that's due to take place in July in Washington.
We must ensure reliable and predictable security assistance to Ukraine for the long haul, so that we rely less on voluntary contributions and more on NATO commitments, less on short-term offers and more on multi-year pledges.
Fabrice Potier, this is a red line that NATO is crossing. They're going to be the ones directly arming Ukraine. Your thoughts?
NATO is moving from the backstage to the front stage, and I think it should be welcome. This is, I think, adding to resources and support that Ukraine is getting from both member states, but also from the European Union. So it puts NATO much more on the front stage of the longer-term effort to support Ukraine and fundamentally to help Ukraine reach victory.
Joachim Biederlich, you've been doing the math. 100 billion over 5 years. Is it doable? Is it easy to do? Is it enough?
I think it's a considerable amount. 100 billion for 5 years, especially on armament, is considerable. I think, and in my view, it's feasible at the same time. But again, how to create such a fund? It's the first time for NATO. And who would share what part of this fund?
Whenever there's a big project in Europe, the rest of the continent turns to Germany.
How to introduce a real positive burden sharing on this. In the EU, we are familiar to burden sharing among member states. We have our normal repetition in the EU. But in NATO, we have never done so. And therefore, the question will be, who will help with what amount? Look at the EU as such. The EU as such has engaged about more than 38 billion euro up till now in favor of Ukraine, militaries only. Civilian, I put aside, but only in military, it's about 33 billion euro engaged by EU. And now 100 billion by NATO in order to give a certain sustainability, in order to underline, as the EU has done, a certain long-term view. For me, it's okay.
Fabrice Potier, when you're making this plan up, if you're whispering into the ear of NATO policymakers, do you go for a worst-case scenario and try to do it without the United States?
Well, I think that's one factor that has led NATO to potentially set up that fund, because I don't think there is a full agreement and the fund is not yet operational. But let me make, I think, bring some nuance here. First, again, like I said, I think this is bringing NATO more to the front stage rather than the backstage, which NATO has been kind of stuck for the past 2 years. However, 100 billion, let's put that into a broader context. So far, we have spent something like between 100 to 120 billion dollars in military aid from both sides of the Atlantic in 2 years. Here we're talking about 100 billion in 5 years. So it is substantial, but it's not enough because we can see that 120 billion over the past 2 years has not been enough for Ukraine to have the capabilities and the weapons to prevail on the battlefield. So I think it's important to kind of see the NATO effort as something positive, but not something necessarily as a game changer. And third point, I think this is not so much and only about providing weapons and money, however important that is, it's about a political commitment. And what Ukraine needs fundamentally is the ultimate political commitment, which is to join the alliance. And that's the way to start finishing this war on terms that are favorable to both Ukraine, but also to the NATO allies.
Gulliver Craig, we were looking earlier at reactions from Moscow, and very sharp. They're saying this is proof that NATO is once again going on the offensive in Ukraine. What's the feeling, though, where you are?
I don't know how to answer that. The feeling in reaction to things that they say in Moscow about NATO being on the offensive for years has been to say
what's going on. I was asking.
Oh, well, you know, they welcome any funding they can get, but the Ukrainians are looking more to what they can get in the near term. These 100 billion coming in 5 years isn't going to be of any use at all if the United States or perhaps some other European countries that can come to the rescue very quickly don't come up with tens of billions in the next weeks. The Ukrainians are saying that they fear a major Russian offensive at the start of the summer, and they admit that they're not prepared for it. They're also, though, admitting that it's not only about the Western aid and the Western armaments coming in, it's also about their own personnel problems in particular and the difficulty of recruiting enough people. The two things are related, because I think more Ukrainians would be willing to go and fight if they thought that they were going to be given enough ammunition.
And that brings us to the point of right now, the procurement. We heard this a couple of months back at the French presidential palace, endorsement for a Czech-led plan to provide more ammo for Ukraine. Before Brussels, the U.S. Secretary of State visiting a Caesar howitzer cannon factory Tuesday outside of Paris. It's looking to double its production this year to 12 of those cannon launchers. Anthony Blinken using the occasion, though, to gently prod Republicans back in Washington in Congress. They're continuing to block a $60 billion Ukraine military package.
The supplementary budget request that President Biden has made to Congress must be fulfilled as quickly as possible. It's needed now. It's needed urgently. But it's also an investment in ourselves. And what we've been talking about today, besides the immediate challenges for Ukraine, it's the work that both of our countries are doing.
Joachim Birlich, the United States has had isolationist periods in its past, but it's in its distant past. Do you ever recall a situation like this one where military aid for a country fighting against Russia was held up by Congress?
Not as far as I can remember. It's a completely new situation.
What do you make of it?
Well, it's a new tendency in the US. The US is turning more to home politics, to dependence on parties, less engagement in Europe, more, let's say, engagement towards American first preoccupations. The border to Mexico, as an example, situation towards Asia, especially towards China. The Europeans could do more, but please, the Americans and the Europeans had agreed in 2014, 10 years ago now, in the summit in Britain, about the famous 2% goal.
2% of GDP.
2% of GDP
the
of
equivalent
each
of
country.
would be devoted to the military and state budgets.
But this should be not only an objective, but an objective on military investment. Where the problem is now in Europe is the military investment. There is not enough military investment. The figures are too low. Look at the situation on ammunition. Look at the situation on the artillery. Caesar, this goal to raise from 2 to 6 and then to 12. It's totally new. The French deliver now armored cars. I wonder why the French have not decided this 6 months ago to deliver to Ukraine. Where are the needs? The needs, as far as I know, are first of all is ammunition, and second is defense, air defense. Germany has no more air defense. The German air defense has gone to the Ukraine. They need a new one to defend itself. But where are the needs? We are not able to fulfill these needs of the Ukrainian army for the moment, and not in time. Where's the problem? We have perhaps developing our armament structures, let's say, without any near experience with regard to war.
So does this happen? You're calling for mutualization of the means of production of defense. Are you saying it should be done with or without the United States, with or without NATO?
Well, please, Europeans, understand that armament is part of a burden sharing between the US and Europe. Don't forget this. On the other hand, I think the Americans understand totally that the Europeans would like and should do more on their own in this field. And therefore, the Americans, I think, will not prohibit or restrain the Europeans from producing more and better. The Europeans, I think, have to consider what's happening now as a real wake-up call. But
aren't they doing so? The German foreign minister in Brussels today was bragging that Berlin is going to spend 2.1% of GDP this year on defense.
Yes, but it's new on the German side. Please look at the German side in the last 10 years.
So
it was a
catching up
tendency. They are catching up now.
Fabrice Potier, what's the answer to the question that Ukrainians asked, that Gulliver posed, the question about how do you get that ammunition to the battlefield now?
Well, first, I think the major mistake we've made, and we continue to make, is we manage this war like accountants rather than to manage this war like strategists. That means we are counting military capabilities, we are counting how much aid we're giving or how much aid we're giving multilaterally, and therefore we should not give bilaterally, which is basically what Berlin is doing right now, instead of thinking about what is the end outcome, what do we want to achieve. And what we want to achieve is to maintain Ukraine as a free, democratic, sovereign country that is going to be fully embedded into the European community. And for that, we need to go further. And not just in terms of weapons and ammunition, but also in terms of our political commitment. And going back to the US, I think, to be honest, to hear Secretary Blinken calling on the Republicans to pass this major appropriation bill makes sense, but this US administration has squandered major opportunity to go much bigger, much earlier, to provide the kind of weapons and the kind of long-range weapons that the Ukrainians have been asking for now a couple of years in order to be able to put the real pressure on the Russian forces and on Vladimir Putin. And the fact that today this administration could really at the stroke of a pen decide to actually provide some longer range systems, or at least to unleash some of the systems they have provided which have been kept on a shorter range capabilities, I think will make a real difference. And the fact that they are politically still managing this war like a content is a contradiction.
Aren't you saying that with the benefit of hindsight? After all, if you think back to February 2022, the whole planet was spooked by the fact that there was the possibility of a confrontation with Russia.
I don't buy this argument. I was one of the voices, and I got many criticisms publicly and privately for calling for going much bigger and making the commitment in terms of weapons supply much more substantial. I was criticized for being one of those calling for javelins and for weapons that are now completely standard and mainstream, and for calling for main battle tanks and fighter jets. And now again, these have been decisions we've made, but we've made them after agonizing times, especially in Berlin, where Russia and Putin have had time to adjust, adapt, and actually be able to be on the advantage. And this is where we're managing this war with 6 months too late. And this is now time to regain the advantage, again, by providing bigger, more substantial aid. This is what NATO is trying to solve, but also by providing a kind of political commitment that we're the only one who can provide, which is the complete security that Ukraine will be part of the NATO collective defense arrangements. And I think this is where it starts to be game over for Vladimir Putin.
Of course, in the meantime, Joachim Bitterlich, there are European elections in June. And we'll see how...
It seems so, at least. But please, when you talk about long range, I understand this Ukrainian demand. But on the other hand, it's not only the Germans who refuse, the Americans too. The Americans have even been warning the Ukrainians to attack oil refineries in Tatarstan or elsewhere within Russia, the last events in the last days.
Yeah, on Tuesday we got
drones going beyond 1,000 kilometers away. The Germans do
yes,
not
but I'm
want
sorry,
to
the Ukrainians have shown, actually they have towed the line, the Americans have towed the line on not overusing certain systems that have been provided by the NATO countries, and even agreeing in joint planning and targeting. So I think the Ukrainians are to be trusted. The fact that we are not trusting them, therefore are not giving them the kind of weapon systems they need to put the pressure back on Putin and on Russian forces is outrageous. I think we can trust them. They're almost a member of the alliance, and they need to be able to finish the job. And finishing the job is to put pressure on Russian supply lines, command structure, and especially on Crimea. And for that, they need longer range systems.
Gulliver Cragg, the Ukrainians, you went, and we aired earlier in the week your report from Zaporizhzhia region, digging in defenses, getting ready for once winter turns to spring and becomes a new Russian advance. But it goes both ways. You heard Ambassador Bitterlich talking about the drones that have had success this week, hitting targets 1,000 kilometers away. What's the feeling as we head towards spring and then summer?
Well, I think that Ukraine was facing 3 main challenges. One is getting enough international aid coming in. The other is getting enough manpower into the army. And the third was building these defenses. After the fall of Avdiivka, the town in Donbass, there was shock at how little defenses there were just beyond Avdiivka. I think it was a little bit exaggerated. It's not like there were no defenses, trenches like you see in my report there elsewhere. I've seen trenches like that near Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. In some parts of the frontline, defenses were already in place. The good news for the Ukrainians is that the Russians do seem to be a bit tired, not ready to launch their next major push just yet. And it seems like the Ukrainians have got time to build these defenses, as I believe they are doing, and other international observers have been saying that they do seem to be getting on with building these defenses, at least in a lot of parts of the front line. Of course, I could only see what they took me to see. I can't say that it's like that elsewhere, but it's certainly quite impressive, the parts where I saw. I wanted to come back to what we were saying about these long-range attacks into Russian territory, because the Ukrainians are really, really bitter at the moment about the international reaction to that. Particularly today, a spokesperson for the United Nations said that the United Nations did not approve of striking civilian targets. The Ukrainians are up in arms about the idea that a munitions factory that they tried to hit or did hit, depending on who you believe, should be considered a civilian target.
Joachim Bitterlich?
Entirely understandable. Please, I've been reading this morning of a Russian air attack against a kindergarten in the Ukraine. Civilian target, clear. And therefore, there are mixed targets. There are targets which are civilian, which are dual use. For example, a refinery for oil is a dual target. I agree. No problem with me in this interpretation. But what the Europeans especially and the US fear is that the Ukrainians could be out of control insofar. And therefore, there is this, let's call it this certain mistrust among allies. This is a matter of fact.
This is an outdated argument that leads basically to ask the Ukrainians to fight a war against a nuclear power with one hand tied in the back. And this is the result we have now, which is that you have a negative stalemate where Ukraine is on the back foot, and if Ukraine fails, Europe fails.
Yes,
so I think we have to kind of face and trust the Ukrainians to do the right thing, which they have done so far. They have legitimate and legal ground to actually strike at Russian targets in Russia and continue supporting them and augment that support. And all the other arguments that keep us from doing the right thing will have consequences for us.
Fabrice Potier, very short because we're out of time. Are we overestimating or underestimating Russia?
Both. We underestimated Vladimir Putin's agenda, that he's really serious about taking over Ukraine, but we overestimate Russia's willingness to escalate because we underestimate our capacity to escalate back and to take control on escalation. And this is the fundamental discussion. We need to learn back the art of escalation in order to restore stability in Europe. It's uncomfortable, but it's true.
Joachim Birol,
I can't agree more. We have to learn really how to stabilize, to help Ukraine to counter and to defend its borders. It's clear. And there is not any, it's more informal. These agreements in Europe are more informal. We do not have a clear strategy and a clear division of labor among Europeans how to help best the Ukraine in these cases.
Maybe today's meeting in Brussels will have more light on that as the hours and days go by. Gulliver Craig's report from the Zaporizhzhia region is on our website, France24.com. I want to thank you, Gulliver, for joining us from Kyiv. I want to thank Fabrice Potier in Brussels. Joachim Bitterlich, thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.